Last time we spoke about the beginning of a conflict between the USSR and Japan. In the frost-hardened dawns of the Chuan and Tumen, two powers were eyeing a ridge called Chuangkufeng, each seeing a prize and fearing a trap. On the Soviet side, weary frontline troops tightened their grip, while Moscow's diplomats restrained through Seoul and Harbin. As July unfolded, Tokyo's generals pushed for a dangerous idea: seize the hill with a surprise strike, then bargain for peace. Seoul's 19th Division was readied in secret. Trains were loaded with men and horses, movement masked, prayers whispered to avoid widening the rift. Japanese scouts in white hanbok disguises peered at trenches, wire, and watchful Russians. The Russian border guards appeared like shadows, yet both sides held their fire. On July the 29th, a skirmish erupted. A platoon crossed a shallow line. Clashes of flare, and bodies and banners would ripple in the cold air. This episode is Night Attacks and Diplomatic Strains. Welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia, and so much more. So give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. It could help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War and Eastern Front Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. Over on both of those, I just released a 6.5-hour-long episode covering the Japanese invasion of the Philippines, 1941 to 1942. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series. It's about 38 episodes and ongoing at this point, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. A second troop train was scheduled to depart Ogachi for Nanam on the night of July the 29th, carrying back the initial elements of the 75th Infantry. At Haigan, Regimental Commander Saito was pulling on his boots at about 4 p.m. when the division informed him that fighting had broken out near Xiaochaofeng since about 3 o'clock, and that the Russians were assembling forces in that area. Sotaka ordered Sato's 3rd Battalion, which had not been slated to leave until the following night, to proceed to Kuchang. The remainder of the regiment was to assemble at Ogachi. After consulting with the division staff officer, Saito, at Ogachi, Saito returned to Haigan with the conclusion that overall developments did not warrant optimism. It was imperative to prepare to move the entire regiment to the battlefield. One of Sato's first actions was to telephone a recommendation to the division that he be allowed to occupy Hill 52, which commanded the approaches to Chuangkufeng from the southern side of Kasan. Sotaka approved, and at 5:30 Yamada's company was ordered to proceed to Shikai, along with Hirahara's battalion. Meanwhile, Suzuki's 15th Heavy Field Artillery Regiment, which had been amongst the last units ordered to leave, had finished loading at Ogachi by about 3 o'clock. Saito recommended to Sotaka that a portion of Suzuki's regiment be attached to him. This was why Sotaka decided to transfer one of the 2 batteries to the 75th Infantry. The rest of the heavy artillery concentrated on Conquest. Sotaka's orders issued at 6:20 p.m. called for Saito to have 2 of his battalions, the 1st and 3rd, cross the Tumen as soon as possible, with engineer support. Attached was Nurakawa's heavy battery. Sato's mission was twofold: to assist Senda and to watch the enemy in the Chuangkufeng area. Saito arrived at about 9:15 p.m. in Shikai. There he assembled a number of his officers, including Yamada, and he explained his plan. The 1st Company plus machine guns were to cross the Tumen from Sosan ahead of the other units. They were going to occupy Hill 52 with an element, and then they would concentrate the main body at the foot of Fangchongting to await Hirahara's battalion. A portion of the 19th Engineers would go to Sosan to assist the 1st Company with its river crossing. Amidst some heavy rain and darkness, the various units set out at about 10:15 p.m. The platoon sent to Hill 52 arrived before dawn on the 30th, the rest of the forces somewhat later, though Sato had intended to move everybody across the river by the early hours. On the 29th, the Engineer Regiment commander, Kobayashi, had arrived at Shikai. He ordered Captain Tamura to handle the crossing in the vicinity of Sozan, as well as preparations for a future offensive with the main body. When Kobayashi reached Kuchang, he learned from Hirahara not only about the frontline situation, but also about Sato's important plans. The Sato force is going to cross the river tonight. A night attack will be launched against Chuangkufeng on the night of the 30th of July. Kobayashi issued orders to his two commanders to assist the crossing by Nakano's infantry unit, the 1st Battalion of the 75th Regiment, at Matsuotsu and Suzan, and in addition to cooperate with the position attack by Nakano to help in the assault on Hill 52. Most of these young officers, such as Sutake, dishing out orders, were performing what the Japanese termed dokudan senko, or arbitrary, independent action. Japanese operational regulations actually contained a section dealing with dokudan senko, by which initiative, not imperiousness, was meant. Two elements were involved: control but encouragement of self-reliant thinking, and the subject became important in the training of officers, all of whom, including such infantry experts as Sutaka, were well acquainted with the requirements. Combat missions were stipulated in operation orders, but if these were not realistic, initiative was to come into play, though only when there was no time to contact superiors, of course. By the same token, commanders had to be ready to assume full responsibility if matters turned out adversely. We were disciplines of the Moltke system of the HES control, with dual authority vis-a-vis the local forces and the Chief of Staff. For those wondering why I speak so much about the operational control and all of the ongoings behind the scenes, my source is actually an investigation report by the Japanese military after this incident. I do apologize if it's a little bit boring for some of you audience members, but I found it fascinating. It's a very thorough paper looking into every single officer involved and all the decision making, because it was a very strong look from the Japanese High Command as to how these situations tend to unfold and how their men react. It's honestly very similar to things I've read about in the Kosovo conflicts that actually plague us to this very day. It's still a real shit show over in that area of the world. Now, the Korea Army's version of events on the 29th of July had no mention of any report received from the division prior to about 5:30 p.m. Details did not reach Seoul in the form of printed divisional intelligence reports and operational orders until August the 1st. The late afternoon report from Kolgun provided the Korea Army authorities with little solid information, but Seoul had to notify higher headquarters immediately. Kitano sent messages to Tokyo and Shinkin at about 7:15 p.m. The command and Kwangtung Army were told that, in addition to Senda's assault party, 40 Japanese soldiers were deployed west of Chuangkufeng and at Yangguangping. The division's main forces had begun the rail pullback from the 28th, leaving behind only 2 infantry battalions, a mountain artillery battalion for the time being. At 9:20 on the 29th, Korea Army headquarters received the text of Sutaka's full report, which concluded, "With a view towards a possible emergency, the division suspended movement back of the 75th Regiment and is making necessary arrangements to have them advance instead. The latest affair derives surely from the enemy's unlawful challenge. It is my firm belief that the nature of this incident differs completely from the one at Chuangkufeng and should be handled separately. At present, since communication with the forward lines is not good, Lieutenant Colonel Senda, who has been at the front, has been entrusted with command, but I assume entire responsibility for the consequences." Instead of boarding their trains at Ogachi, Sato's regiment and supporting engineers moved to the Manchurian side of the Tumen as soon as possible. Sutaka called Sato's 2nd Battalion to Kolgun as a divisional reserve. Subsequent dispatches claim that, quote, Number 1. Senda's unit, which had driven off the intruders in the Xiaochaofeng area once, were engaged against new Soviet forces. Number 2. Senda's unit had expelled trespassers and a combat situation had developed near Xiaochaofeng. Number 3. Fighting was going on in the vicinity of Xiaochaofeng. Korea Army Headquarters, however, obtained no more important communication concerning the events of July the 29th than a mere report sent that evening by Sutaka, and it revealed his concern about a possible Soviet attack in the Wuchaozu sector near the neck of the long Chuangkufeng appendix. After the clash at Xiaochaofeng, a general officer, Morimoto, happened to be visiting Colonels Okido and Tanaka in Annam. Both of them were said to be of the pronounced opinion that no troubles ought to be provoked with the USSR, while the critical Hankau operation lay ahead. Yet Sutaka apparently had some intention of striking at the Soviet intruders using the 75th Regiment. They urged that this policy not be adopted and that Sutaka be approached directly. The channel through Nakimura, the divisional chief of staff, was hopeless. Although in agreement, General Morimoto declined to approach Sutaka, since the latter seemed to have made up his mind, and it would be inappropriate to meddle with his command. Sutaka was functioning as an operations chief at the time. Apart from the mobilization staff officer, who was not as enthusiastic about the aggressive action, the only other officer who may have affected the decision-making process was the Honchon OSS Chief Major Tanaka Tsuchijiro, a positive type who shared Sutaka's views and was probably with him on the 29th as well as the 30th. Although developments at Sutaka's command post were known more as a result of the silence than of elucidation, the two men possessed considerable information about the thinking at the Korea Army level. Sutaka contacted us only after his men had driven out the enemy near Xiaochaofeng. Till then, the front had been relatively quiet, and we were of the opinion all or most of the deployed forces were on their way home. We at Seoul had no foreknowledge of or any connection with the 29th July affair. Reports came in. We never sent specific orders. Triggered by the affray at Xiaochaofeng, the division attacked on its own initiative. It was our understanding that very small Japanese forces had been committed to evict a dozen enemy scouts, and that when a platoon of ours got atop the hill, they observed surprisingly huge hostile concentrations to the rear. This was probably why the platoon pulled back, although much has been made of the desire to obey the non-aggression policy to the letter. We at Seoul felt that this was a troublesome matter, that our side had done something unnecessary. When the division finally made its report, the Army had to reach some decision. There were two irreconcilable ways of looking at things. We might condemn what had been done, and the division ought to be ordered to pull out promptly, having arbitrarily and intolerably acted against the known facts that imperial sanction for the use of force had been withheld, and Tokyo directed evacuation of the moved-up units. The opposing, eventually prominent view was that the division commander's course of action ought to be approved. Visual of small-scale maps of the locale indicated a clear violation of the frontier, something not proved in the case of Chuangkufeng. We share the division commander's interpretation. His BGU had its mission, and he was acting with foresight to solve matters positively and on his own, since he was the man closest to the problem. General Nakamura felt that the latest development was inevitable. Our units did not cross the two men until the Soviets attacked us in force. Therefore, the division's actions were approved, and a report was rendered promptly to Tokyo. It could be said that our outlook served to cover the division commander, in a way. But if Imperial General Headquarters had ordered us to desist, we would have. To all of that, Nakamura would add, I was of the opinion the only solution was to drive the Soviet troops outside of Manchukuoan territory. Therefore, I approved the action by the division. Such sanctions had been granted on the basis of information supplied to Seoul by Sutaka on the evening of July the 29th, again post facto. At 1:20 a.m. on the 30th, Nakamura wired Sutaka a message characterized by gracious phrasing that suggested his grave concern. One ought to be satisfied with expelling from Manchurian territory the enemy attacking our unit on the heights southwest of Xiaochaofeng. It is necessary to keep watch on the enemy for the time being, after having pulled back to the heights mentioned above, but we desire that matters be handled carefully to avoid enlargement. In case the foe has already pulled back south of Xiaochaofeng, he need not be attacked. Nakamura also sent a wire to the AGS chief, the war minister, and the Kwangtung Army commander. After conveying the information received from Sutaka, Nakamura continued, "In spite of the fact that our troops have been patient and cautious, this latest incident near Xiaochaofeng started with Soviet forces' arrogant border trespassing, an unlawful challenge. Therefore, I am convinced that this affair must be dealt with separately from the incident at Chuangkufeng. Nevertheless, I shall endeavor to handle matters so that the incident will not spread, and shall make it my fundamental principle to be satisfied with evicting from Manchurian territory the hostile forces confronting us. The Korea Army Chief of Staff is being dispatched quickly to handle the incident." The Korea Army was painfully slow to act, said the Kwangtung Army Major, who was speaking on behalf of the Kwangtung Army. In the case of the remote Xiaochaofeng, there was an inevitable gap between the on-spot occurrences and the AGS reactions. By then, Aruse, Kotani, and Ario, Inada's observers, had returned to Japan, and their return must have exerted significant effects on the central operational thinking. Kotani remembered that his AGS subsection had given him a welcome home party on the night of the 29th, when an emergency phone call was received from the duty officer. It was about the clash at Xiaochaofeng. The festivities came to an abrupt end, and I headed for the office. From then till the ceasefire that would occur on August 11th, I remained at the AGS night and day. Since the 19th Division had furnished higher headquarters with minimal information, Tokyo, like Seoul, had only few ostensible facts to act upon. But this had been the first combat test for the Korea Army, which needed all the encouragement and assistance possible. Although Japanese field armies, notably the Kwangtung Army, were notorious for insubordination, one could not overemphasize the fact that the Korea Army, which was a bit more meek, but more tractable. If Nakamura had concluded that Sutaka acted properly, which reports from Seoul indicated, the AGS could hardly demur. It would have been unrealistic to think that Tokyo, although cautious, was softer about the Russian problem than the frontline forces. There had been no concern over the time lags. Details were Seoul's province. Reaction took time at every level of the chain of command. Decision-making in the Japanese army had been a many-layered process. The Army General Staff had been of the opinion that initial guidance ought to have been provided to the Korea Army as soon as possible, particularly since there had been evidence of failure to convey intentions properly to the front, and no high command staff officer remained to direct matters. After hearing from Seoul twice about the Xiaochaofeng affair, the responsible Army General Staff officers conferred at length. Stress had been laid out on the indivisibility of the Xiaochaofeng and Chuangkufeng incidents. It had also been evident that further information was required, on the basis of, quote, the handling policy of the Xiaochaofeng incident. This was drafted, and Tada notified the Korea and Kwangtung armies accordingly on the 30th of July. Nakamura had received the telegram at about 4:50 p.m., and its contents were retransmitted to Kitano, then to Kaohsiung. The Xiaochaofeng incident is progressing along lines of our policy, leave things to local units, which have been adhering to the principle of non-enlargement, have them report on frontline situation without fail. The Army General Staff and the Korea Army were calling for prudence, but the division, well down the rungs of the ladder of command, were initiating actions that jeopardized the government's basic policy. Earlier quabbling about restraints on unit-size elements crossing into Manchuria had been abandoned after the firefight near Xiaochaofeng. At 3:30 p.m., Takanouchi's battalion, part of the 76th Regiment, had been directed to assist Senda near Yangguangping. At about 6:20, Sutaka was ordering the 75th Regiment to head for the Kuchong sector and to be ready for any assaults against the Russians in the Chuangkufeng area. Support was to be provided by Kobayashi's engineers, by Iwano's transportation men, and by Suzuki's heavy guns. Of particular interest had been Sutaka's acceptance of Sato's recommendation that elements be sent to occupy Hill 52, a measure linked with a possible Japanese attack against Chuangkufeng. Sato had decided by evening that the new situation required rapid deployment of his forces across the river. At Shikai, he conducted a briefing of his officers. Sutaka's orders conveyed orally by staff officers had stipulated, the division will take steps to secure the border line immediately, even if the situation undergoes change. The Sato unit will advance immediately to the left shore, reinforce Senda's unit, and maintain a strict watch on the enemy in the Chuangkufeng area. At 11:20, the last elements ordered forward arrived at Shikai Station. Sato instructed only his headquarters and the Ito Company to get off. The rest of the troop train, primarily the 1st Nakano's Battalion, was to move on to Hongwei. From there, the soldiers proceeded to the Tuamen near Sozan. With his staff and Ito's company, Sato trudged in silence through the mud from Shikai to the shore of Matsuotso, starting at about 12:30, and he reached the crossing site at 3 a.m. Reconnaissance had proved satisfactory. At the crossings, the hard-working engineers rowed his 1st and 3rd battalions across, company by company. Near dawn, at about 4:30 a.m., he traversed the river himself. The movement had been completed in about an hour. When Sato's infantry finally got across, they proceeded to the skirt of Fangchongting and assembled in secrecy. Not until about 8 a.m. did the regimental headquarters, Ito's company, and Hirahara's battalion reach Hill 147, already held by Noguchi's company west of Chuangkufeng. By then, plans had fallen behind schedule by at least several hours because of difficulties in train movements going forward. Sato also remembered torrential rains. Other officers mentioned it was extremely dark that night. Members of Nakano's battalion pinpointed a shortage of engineer boats from Kuchang. Engineers rowed some boats downstream during the night, but 6 of them were kept at Matsuotso. This left only 3 boats for the moving of 400 men of the 1st Battalion. The unit was slated to storm Chuangkufeng across the river at Sozan. Sato had wanted all of his troops across well before dawn on the 30th. A division staff officer rightly thought that Tsutaka had already advised Sato in secret to, quote, attack at an opportune time, as the night of July the 29th had been intended for a surprise assault. Perhaps there was not enough time for all of the attack preparations. Kobayashi's engineers admitted problems in moving boats to the Sozan. Although the water level had gone up because of the daily rains recently, there were still many shallows and the current was irregular. Not only was it hard to move downstream, but dense fog also complicated the work. Nevertheless, the units at both sites were able to accomplish the river crossing operation approximately as scheduled. Meanwhile, after performing a reconnaissance of the Soviet defenses along the Manchurian bank, Suzuki, the commander of the 15th Heavy Field Artillery Regiment, crossed the Kolgon Bridge on the 30th of July with his 1st battery, and he established positions on the edge of Shuilufeng Hill. Once Captain Nurakawa was attached to the 75th Infantry on the 29th, he dispatched his 2nd battery by train to Shikai that night. Although firing sites had been surveyed northwest of Zhousuzan, the battery had to traverse 2 weak narrow bridges in the darkness. With 2 15-centimeter howitzers to haul, plus 5 caissons and wagons, the unit faced pretty tense moments. The gun sites themselves were worrisome. They were scarcely masked by observation from Chuangkufeng, and the single road to them from the unloading station ran through a paddy area that was similarly exposed. By 12 o'clock on the 30th, Sato exerted operational control over the following units: his own forces, the Nakano's battalion east of Fangchongting, Hirahara's reinforced battalion west of Changchongfeng, a platoon from Nakajima's infantry company on Hill 52, and Noguchi's company on Hill 147. And from other forces, Senda's 2nd Kanda BGU Company, 2 reinforced companies from Takanouchi's battalion of Okido's 76th Regiment near Xiaochaofeng, and a 75mm half battery from the 25th Mountain Artillery on the Manchurian side with Saito. On the Korean shore, another half battery comprising 2 15-centimeter howitzers from Nurikawa's unit of the 15th Heavy Field Artillery was also in place. The 19th Engineers operating near the crossing sites, though 1 platoon remained at Fangchongting, and as Sato recalled, "We were now deployed at last to cope with any situation." His command post was set in foxholes on open ground at Chuangchongfeng, a central hill that offered excellent observation and control over the actions around Chuangkufeng to the east and Xiaochaofeng to the north. Not content with suspending the pullouts of units and deploying additional combat troops across the Tumen, Tsutaka decided to recall the division headquarters, mountain artillery, cavalry, signal medical, and veterinary personnel from Nanam. At dawn on July the 30th, Nanam issued orders for Colonel Tanaka to move 500 men and 300 horses to Ogachi by rail. Most of the increment came from Tanaka's horse-drawn 25th Mountain Artillery. The colonel reached the Korean side of the Tumen at about 5 a.m. on the 31st of July. The preceding emergency measures were being implemented by Tsutaka, even as he received Nakamura's calming telegram on July 30th, enjoining non-expansion. Chuangkufeng Hill was not even mentioned. Nakamura's concern was typified by Kitano flying to the front. At about 10 a.m. on the 30th, Kitano sent the division chief of staff a cautious follow-up cable. Based on the consistent policy for handling the Chuangkufeng incident, and of the Army commander's earlier telegram, kindly take steps to ensure careful action in connection with the affair in the Xiaochaofeng vicinity, lest there be an enlargement. At 1:45 p.m., Nakamura transmitted another restraining message to Sutaka. The division is to secure Chuangkufeng and the heights southwest of Xiaochaofeng, using present frontline units. Unless there is an enemy attack, however, resort to force will depend on separate orders. Several hours later, at about 4:50, Nakamura received instructions from Tada. The Xiaochaofeng case was being left to the local forces, who were pursuing the desired policy of non-enlargement, but prompt reporting was desired. At 7:30 p.m., the retransmitted message was received by Kitano, already at the front, with Sutaka at Kongun. After his units had crossed the Tumen on the 30th of July, Sado ordered a strict watch and directed preparations for an assault based on the plans. He conferred with Senda at Chuangkufeng and observed the enemy. Even after dawn, the frontline commanders who had crossed the river remained uncertain about when the attack would actually be staged. While Sado's force conducted reconnaissance to prepare for a daylight offensive, orders arrived at around 8 a.m., indicating, "We intend a night attack, so conceal your activities." Daytime movements were prohibited. Sado then explained the impression he had derived from Senda and his intelligence on which he based his estimates. Exploiting the impasse in diplomatic negotiations, the enemy's side had steadily reinforced frontline offensive strength and trespassed anew near Xiaochaofeng. They now had a battalion and a half of infantry plus 20 artillery pieces in the area, some south of Xiaochaofeng, the others at 4 positions immediately east of Lake Khasan. At least a dozen, maybe 20 tanks were deployed in the sector opposite of us. About 300 well-armed active Russian troops were at Chuangkufeng. I decided that an attack ought to be staged that night. First of all, we were going to chill the insolent enemy by a courageous night assault, a method characteristic of the Imperial Army. Then all kinds of fire were to be combined in a surprise attack against the positions. Our intention was to jolt the Russians, demonstrate the true strength of our combat fire, and by combination of night and dawn attacks, cut down losses, which our left flank units would have incurred if a night assault alone were staged. We had considered 2 plans, a night attack against Chuangkufeng by the 3rd Battalion from the north, or by the 1st Battalion from the south. On the 30th, I decided to execute the second plan, using my 1st Nakano Battalion, to avoid simultaneous involvement around Xiaochaofeng, where the foe was now to be alerted. The Japanese army ordinarily favored surprise assaults without supporting guns, since firepower was regarded as secondary in close combat and artillery was in short supply. According to the regimental journal, telephone contacts from the morning of the 30th indicated that the division commander shared the same line of thinking as Sato. By noon, Sutaka made his stance explicit. A phone call from Kochang conveyed to Sato the gist of the critical divisional order. First, a detailed briefing on Soviet troop concentrations and dispositions, firing positions, troops, and armor south of Xiaochaofeng, entanglements in forces at Chuangkufeng, large concentrations behind and west of Lake Khasan, tanks and ground formations moving north of the lake, a heavy concentration near the lake to the northwest, 1 confirmed and 2 suspected positions along the eastern shore, and another with artillery far to the south. Then the order stated that Sato's forces included the Tokunochi Battalion from the 76th Infantry, 1 mountain artillery platoon, and 1 engineer platoon were to strengthen their positions, and at the same time promptly evict from the Manchurian territory the intruding and advancing enemy. However, pursuit must not be pushed too far lest the border be crossed. Shortly after noon, Sutaka issued another order to form a new force under Senda, who was to strengthen border security along the Shulongfang-Hunchon line. As was with Sato, Senda was to eject the intruding and advancing enemy from the Manchurian soil, but to not pursue them across the border. By mid-afternoon, Sato knew not only what he wanted to do, but also Sutaka's intentions. At 3:30 p.m., he assembled all subordinate officers at Chuangkufeng and dictated minute attack instructions. Intelligence indicated that the enemy continued to fortify points of importance along the Chuangkufeng-Xiaochaofeng line. Sato's plan was to annihilate hostile elements that had crossed the border north and south of Chuangkufeng. His concept went far beyond any frontal assault. When Nakano's battalion would jump off south of Chuangkufeng, one reinforced company, Takeshida's 10th, was to attack from the north. Since the sun rose at about 5 a.m., Sato intended to wipe out the enemy during the 3 hours of darkness. Another battalion, Hirahara's 3rd, would be held in reserve, with Ito's 6th Company ready to launch a night attack against Chuangkufeng from the northwest if necessary. Small forces deployed southeast of Hill 52 were to block the arrival of the Soviet reinforcements around the southern shores of Kazan. Only after Chuangkufeng was secured, and fire swept the high ground south of Xiaochaofeng, would a reinforced battalion, Tokunouchi's 1st from the 76th Regiment, undertake a dawn assault to clear the Russians from that sector. An engineer platoon would assist both the night and dawn assault battalions with obstacle clearing. There would be no artillery support until dawn, when the available guns were to provide maximum coverage. Notably, even the movement of a single anti-tank gun warranted mention. Sato concluded the attack order by directing that each unit mask his intentions after sunset. Tokunouchi was to act to check the enemy as soon as the sun went down. In connection with the dawn barrage against the enemy southwest of Xiaochaofeng, key personnel were to study the best way to exploit the sudden fire, described as gale and lightning. They were also to be ready to destroy enemy tanks. A green star shell would be fired to signal the success of the night attack. The code words were Jijiki, honesty, and Yudmo, bravery. At midnight, the regimental commander would be at the northwest foot of Chuangkufeng. The order stressed typical night attack preparations, secrecy and concealment, avoidance of confusion, anti-tank defense, and flare signaling of success. Sato added his own flare with his daily motto as code words and the reference to whirlwind fire. Impending action times were explicitly set when the order was issued at 3:30 on the 30th, more than 10 hours before the 1st Battalion was to jump off. The key to success in a night assault lay in the absolute prohibition of firing by their side, and bold, courageous charging. Sato reminded his men that life is granted again after death. Nakano then assembled his company commanders east of Wangchongting and issued his battalion order at about 6:30 p.m. A few hours after Sato's briefing of the assault commanders, Tsutaka arrived at the 75th Regimental Command Post. This visit late on July 30th was central to allegations later that Sato, not Tsutaka, conceived and executed the night attack on his own initiative. Divisional orders giving Sato his core mission had already been conveyed by telephone, of course. After 4 p.m., Tsutaka boarded a motorboat at Kuchang, and he went to the Manchurian side to verify frontline conditions. Soviet snipers south of Yongkongping fired several shots, but his craft reached Matsuoto landing and proceeded to Chuangkufeng to meet Sato. Sato described the situation. Frontline enemy forces have been reinforced steadily and had begun a vigorous offensive. The foe was provoking us, and the matter had grown very serious. I had already issued orders at 3:30 p.m. to take the initiative and to deal the enemy a smashing blow. I'd like to take this time to remind all of you this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. And if you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. On a frostbitten dawn by the Chuan of two men, Russia and Japan locked eyes over Chuangkufeng. Diplomats urged restraint, yet Tokyo's generals pushed a bold gamble: seize a hill with a surprise strike and bargain later. Japanese divisions, engineers, and artillery edged towards the border, while Soviet sentries braced for a confrontation that could widen into a full-blown war.